Well, hi everybody, and welcome to week 11, Principles of Independence. Now, we started last week on the road to independence and walked through several events and documents that were drafted, including the Stamp Act resolves in 1765. We started in 1761 and introduced the idea that there would be 15 years of suffering and petitioning and enduring infringements on rights of Englishmen by the colonists before we actually come to a point of independence. And we're going to get there today. You will have noticed that you have a fairly large packet of note sheets this week, 16 pages. The first 10 are what I'm going to cover with you in our lecture right now. And then the last 6 guys go along with a video. I want you to leave them in that order in your notebook. But those last 6 are an introduction to the first part of the Declaration of Independence, where we're going to actually parse the words and look at the ideas that are represented by those words. It's deep, it's rich, and it's wonderful. Now, when I say we're studying the principles of independence, and that's where we're going today, the truth is we have been studying the principles of independence since week 1 because they're biblical ideas. And we started way back at the time of the Hebrew Republic, didn't we? We started with the ideas represented there. Voluntary consent of the people to God's law, that they entered into a covenant relationship in their civil government. We saw that expressed over and over again throughout Scripture, this idea that legitimate governments are formed by voluntary consent, that there should be representation of the people in their government, the idea of a higher law to which everyone is accountable, including the king, so the king is under the law. The idea of local self-government distributed out and down, as opposed to a centralized form, which lends itself to tyranny, that God's system of civil government is distributing power out to the tribes, right? Where there's local self-government and a limited union. So all of those ideas and many more we've seen expressed as we've moved forward through time. And now we're getting to the founding documents of America, the Declaration and the Constitution, where we're going to really see them come to fruition. But the reason that we do this is when you leave this class, I want you to be firmly convinced, you guys, that the ideas you see expressed in our Declaration, in our Constitution, in our Bill of Rights, and what American government was set up on are biblical principles. They are not just another set of good ideas, they're God ideas. Because if they're good ideas, if that's all they were, well, that's kind of new and different, and it worked out for about 250 years. If that's all it was, well, then maybe it's time to evolve to something different, to some other new good idea, like socialism. Well, why not? So if they were just good ideas, well, maybe someone has a better idea. But if they were God ideas, if your government system is rooted in God ideas, those are never changing. They're transcendent. They represent a biblical idea of who man is and how civil government should operate according to God. Well, if that is the foundation of this government, if God ideas are what it's all about, well, God ideas are worth fighting for, sacrificing for, and dying for. And quite frankly, that's what your founding generation knew. They recognized that there were these transcendent ideas that deserved defending, and that they were willing to give their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honors to do so. So that's what I hope you leave this class with as well, is that firm conviction in your heart that these are ideas that are truly worth defending and passing down to your posterity. All right, thanks for enduring my little introduction here, you guys. Let's get right to our note sheets. Here we go, week 11, Principles of Independence. So we left off with the Townshend Acts. That's where we stopped last week. So the Townshend Acts were additional duties on paint and lead and glass and tea, amongst other things. And they really were Parliament's statement that they had the authority to tax the American colonists, where the colonists had said, no, we've always had the right to tax ourselves locally. And yes, the king has a right to collect revenue from our colony, but Parliament, we have no representation in Parliament. They can't possibly know what our colony could bear or not bear, or how best to collect that money. And we've always had the right to decide for ourselves how we would collect the money that is due to the crown. The crown just simply puts in a request for their 50,000 pounds, and then our Virginia House of Burgesses determines how they will raise that and send it over. So that was what was not happening now. Those rights of Englishmen to have representation when your property is being distributed, that's what's being violated. But we know there were other things being violated as well, right? The quartering of troops. They were taking over the government. They were sending officials that were now crown appointed officials and not locally selected. Trial by jury had been violated as people were hauled out of their colony into other places, to admiralty courts where there was no trial by jury. So all of those things were violations of their rights as Englishmen. Okay, 17 says Towns and Acts are now in place. Parliament has made quite clear that they believe they have the right to tax the colonists. In 1768 and 69, that 2-year period was really spent resisting. But I mean resisting as in the biblical process. And what's the first step? It's petitioning, right? So we don't show up in the streets with pitchforks and torches. We are writing and we are petitioning and we are appealing these things. So John Dickinson of Pennsylvania is a leader that comes to the fore in this moment, and he's a leader in the Legislative Assembly in Pennsylvania, and he's going to play a prominent role in the future. So I want you to meet him now, but he writes 12 what he calls letters from a Pennsylvania farmer. So I just want you to know that title. You may hear it again, and they're very influential. They're kind of editorials in the newspaper, like a blog post today. It circulates widely in the colonies. People become familiar with him and his ideas and why Pennsylvania opposes the actions of Parliament, the illegal actions, and it really begins to galvanize patriot support. It gives people something. Have you read those letters to a Pennsylvania farmer? Yeah, what'd you think? And they begin to talk about it and really support one another. It kind of unites sentiment in favor of the patriot cause. At the same time, the Massachusetts Assembly, always on the ball, they're going to be petitioning the king and Parliament over the foreign government officers that are now present, the illegal trials that are taking place, the quartering of troops, etc. The Massachusetts Assembly also sends what's called a circular letter to other colonial assemblies, so to the other colonies. And that I would best describe as like a forwarded email. So they write it, they send it to Delaware, they ask them to comment on it, and then forward it on to other colonies. So that at the leadership level, we're accomplishing kind of the same thing that John Dickinson is accomplishing through his writings in the newspaper. We want to be talking about these things and coming to a unified front on how we feel about these issues and how to petition, how to appropriately and productively petition Parliament and the king. So they send this circular letter. Well, what happens is, particularly in Virginia and North Carolina, Massachusetts has already done it, but they are passing resolutions of opposition to things that they think are illegal. And then they're petitioning the king saying, look, we have these grievances. We think this is out of line and not in keeping with English common law. So Massachusetts, Virginia, and North Carolina are actively petitioning and listing their grievances, and the king responds by ordering that their assemblies be dissolved. So their legislative assemblies are sent home and not allowed to meet. That should ring a bell with you, because that's exactly what happened with the tyrant king, Charles I, the one that led the country into the English Civil War, right? When the Puritans in Parliament were issuing petitions to him because he was forcing illegal loans, imprisoning people, not giving them a fair trial, quartering troops. So they issued the Petition of Right in 1628, and what did he do? Dissolved them, right, for 12 years. So we see the same response, this very high-handed response. Parliament and the king have evidently not learned the lesson of what's now almost 150 years have passed between Petition of Right and this moment. I popped this map in here just so you could see these different places that are now experiencing the heavy hand of Parliament and the king that is beginning to really spread across the colonies, and it's not just Massachusetts that's experiencing this. Okay, so now jumping forward to the year 1770. So 1767 was the Townshend Acts. 1768 and 69 are primarily spent petitioning and resisting verbally, if you will, in a written form. And then there's a turning point event, March 5th, 1770, called the Boston Massacre. So most of you will have at least heard of that event. Let me at least spell out for you what happens. So there's an event at the Customs House in downtown Boston, not far, just steps away from the port itself, from where all the docks are located. And the Customs House is where all those duties are collected, Townshend duties, which the people of Boston and all of the colonists believe are illegal. So there's a lot of tension. And then, as I've mentioned before, there are increasing numbers of British troops who are occupying the city. It gets to a point where I think we said 1 in 6 people in the town of Boston is a British soldier that's being quartered in private properties all around the town. So you can imagine, tensions are very high. And then on top of that, it may have been the day before or a few days before, there was a young man named Christopher Sider. You don't remember his name, but he was a young kid, young teenager, and he and some friends had been harassing this guy that was a shop owner that was loyal to the crown. And he was shot by the shop owner and killed. So again, tensions are very high. There's restlessness in the streets. It's kind of like dry tinder waiting for a spark. And there was a fight that broke out down at the docks, and it escalated. And then pretty soon we had an angry group of Boston citizens who made their way to the Customs House, they were angry at the British soldiers. That had been the subject of this fist fight that had broken out. So they know there's going to be a British sentry standing right in front of the Customs House with his musket. And so they approach him, they kind of start yelling at him, and he's pretty soon some buddies show up, some other sentries to guard their concerns. So, 4 or 5 more show up to guard the Customs House, and pretty soon you've got a handful, 10, 12 British soldiers that are there, and an officer shows up, and as he's taking command of the scene, he's telling them all, under no circumstances are you to fire. Do not fire. Well, some soldier in the midst of this chaos, and guys, it had gotten chaotic, like the Bostonians were now throwing snowballs at them and yelling, and these weren't like light, fluffy snowballs. These were ice-packed, heavy, hurtful kind of snowballs, ice chunks. And in the midst of the chaos, some soldier heard fire and fired. And when he did, all of his compatriots did. So one single volley, that's all it was fired. But when the smoke cleared, there were 5 colonists that were dead, unarmed colonists. 7 more were injured. And I'm sorry, all 5 weren't dead immediately, but there would be eventually 5 that would die of their wounds and 7 injured. So now we have a real problem, because the leadership was not there. The Sons of Liberty were not there. Samuel Adams wasn't there. John Adams, Paul Revere, Dr. Warren, Joseph Warren. None of those guys were present at the scene. And now they kind of had to sort out what happened and how to respond to this. So that's why I have March 5th and then March 6th, because we want to pay close attention to the response, because the emotional response would have been to go home and grab your muskets, and it could have been chaos in the streets, taking on these British occupiers. That was the emotional desire of much of the town of Boston. But leadership said, no, this is not. Remember, guys, we always appeal to the higher law, because that's what we desire. That's what we're appealing. We've been petitioning for the king and parliament to abide by the law, and we have to set that example. And they will. So the very next day, there's a town meeting, and that would be like a city council meeting. So the town comes together, and of course, they're hearing all this testimony and hearing about what happened and how to respond. And they come up with the instructions from the people of the town of Boston. That's why I put it right up here. So March 6th, come the instructions from the people of the town of Boston. There's a delegation of men who are sent to address the guy in charge, he was the lieutenant governor, because the governor wasn't present. So they go to address the lieutenant governor, Hutchinson, and they bring with them the law. This image is really very important. This is a portrait of Samuel Adams. And I love this for a lot of reasons. Samuel Adams gets a terrible rap in modern culture. Number one, it's all about beer for some reason. So he's he's this party guy or something, which he absolutely was not. That was not his character whatsoever. He also gets the rap of being this rabble-rousing, mob-leading, protest, violence kind of guy. Absolutely the opposite. He totally recognized that for his movement, what he was trying to accomplish to be viewed as legitimate, that violence had to be avoided at all costs. His cousin writes about it, others write about it. He's one of the most upstanding, strong Christian men in American history. So I'm actually going to post a little link on our page this week, kind of a defense of Samuel Adams, because I also am recommending to you at some point, doesn't have to be this week, whenever you have time, you should start the HBO series John Adams. It is excellent, but it falls for the societal stereotype of Samuel Adams. And so that's actually what prompted a scholarly article that was defending Samuel Adams, and I've kind of built on that scholarly article and posted it. So, okay, what happens on March 6th? Samuel Adams will lead the delegation that goes to see Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson. This portrait, painted several years later by John Singleton Copley, is painted as if you, the viewer, are Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson. So here comes Samuel Adams, and he spreads out on your desk all of these papers. You see the large one with this large wax seal. This is the original charter for Massachusetts. And he is pointing to it, and he's saying to the governor, we have the rights of Englishmen. What did you expect would eventually happen if you continued to infringe upon, our rights to not have to quarter troops in time of peace? You violated our rights to trial by jury. You have violated our right to representation in taxation and other laws. You are bringing in outside governing officials and not allowing us local self-government that's guaranteed in our charter. In his left hand, he clasped that rolled up piece of paper. That's the instructions from the people of the town of Boston. So guys, what this speaks to, not only is it a powerful portrait, we analyze it in more detail in American history, but it speaks to the proper colonial response, which wasn't, we could have Samuel Adams out in the street with a torch, right, leading a mob. That's not what we see. We have Samuel Adams pointing back to the higher law to which the king is accountable. So instructions is your blank. Instructions is what goes here. And then I have this image here is a very famous portrayal of what happened there at the Customs House. So here you see the Custom House in the background, which Paul Revere is the one who created this engraving, and then you're looking at a hand-colored version, but Paul Revere was a silversmith and an engraver, so he also could produce those metal plates that could be used in the newspapers to provide illustrations, and he got his illustration of what had happened to the presses first. So this became the image that was impressed in the minds of colonists across the 13 colonies, that this is what went down. So we see the firing of these soldiers, and he shows us that the commander is actually telling them to fire. In testimony that came later, there was much doubt cast on that, even by Paul Revere himself. So, all right. The Bostonians had been petitioning, after all, right, for careful protection of their rights as Englishmen, including fair jury trial. So they now recognized this is the moment. We are still asking the king, we're asking the governor to abide by the law, and we are still in control of the court system here. Are we going to provide for them a fair trial? Are they going to get a fair trial under this Massachusetts colonial government? Well, they carefully guarded that. In fact, John Adams stepped forward to become the defense attorney for the accused British soldiers and argued their case so effectively that he argued them right out of, well, not all consequences, but they were found innocent of murder charges. Paul Revere will testify on their behalf, and even one of the dying victims will testify in support of the accused soldiers. Because again, this says volumes about what they stood for and the principles that they were willing to defend, even when it didn't necessarily work to their benefit. The people of Boston were up in arms and angry, and they wanted what they perceived as justice after 5 of their compatriots had been murdered in the street. but the facts of the matter. Facts are stubborn things, and so they wanted to hold to the facts, hold to a fair trial, and recognize that this was a very difficult and chaotic situation, and that these were not men who should be convicted of murder, and they weren't. Results. The British troops were all relocated. They were pulled out, relocated at least temporarily to Castle William, which was out in Boston Harbor, which really relieved a lot of the tension. Providentially, unknown to anybody else, on March 5th, the very day the massacre had taken place, back in England, Parliament had voted that day to repeal most of the Townshend Acts. All of them were repealed except those on tea. Word won't get here, of course, for several weeks. It can take up to 6 weeks for a ship to cross, and so for news to arrive came much later, probably in April. However, now we get this quote-unquote good news. Now, guys, if that good news had come 8 weeks earlier, there might have been a different response. Perhaps they would have said, oh, that's great. Okay, well, fine. Maybe we'll cave and pay the tax on tea. But at this point, they were now strengthened in their resistance to all British tyranny. We're going to do the right thing, and we're going to keep holding them to do the right thing. And so even though the other duties were repealed, that one on tea remained, and they saw it for what it was. It was a trap. If we can get them to accept that, they knew in years to come that they would expand it to other things. If on principle we've accepted it and we've said that it's legitimate, then it'll grow. Don't let the camel's nose under the tent. So the response was they still refused to accept British tea shipments and instead began buying Dutch tea. You do need to know that that was considered illegal by Parliament. They were supposed to only be buying from the British East India Tea Company and paying the tax. The colonists justified in their minds that the tax was illegal. They had no other recourse except to buy from somebody else, and so they did. So they were buying from the Dutch limited amounts of tea, but because they did not have readily available, and it was expensive, they don't now have this readily available tea, and so the colonists began to shift to other things. And so you really have the Boston Massacre and then the follow-on to that event to thank for the popularity of things like herbal teas in America. Hot chocolate became a new fad, as well as coffee drinking. And Paul Revere made the transition very nicely. He had been well known for his ability to craft, the highest quality silver teapot, and he now became a specialist in the silver coffee pot. This is a Paul Revere silver coffee pot that you're looking at. In 1772, we have another development that I want to mention to you. The Committees of Correspondence are begun, and this is a communications network. It is colonial internet, I guess. So it's an intentional communications network, and it was started by none other than Samuel Adams up in Massachusetts, who then gets in touch with other leaders across the colonies and says, we need to be not just these circular letters coming out from time to time. We need to do this regularly and intentionally, and we need to start talking about how these acts passed by Parliament, what specific rights they're violating, what our strategy is for petitioning Parliament and the King, and how we can come back to, a proper respect for our jurisdiction as colonies, our local self-government, our right to representation. How do we do that? So they began to really debate the issues through these circular letters that were going back and forth, discussing strategies, and they became a tool for actually educating people, not just on the latest news and the latest problem we're having with Governor Hutchinson and down here with our Governor Dunmore. Yes, that was being discussed, but they were talking about big stuff. They were talking about the principles. They were reading Beza and Calvin and the Huguenots and Blackstone and Montesquieu, and that's the stuff that's showing up in these letters that they're debating and discussing with one another. Okay, what are the fundamental rights? Reminding themselves of the fundamental rights of man and how those are protected. So the underlying principles of liberty were really being discussed in the Committees of Correspondence. This would be the difference between, watching the news, which is just going to cover the issues, versus a government study, reading the philosophers and understanding what's really at stake and where we should stand on these things. In 1773, we're going to have another crucial moment on the timeline here, because in 1773 in May, Parliament passes something called the Tea Act. And the result will be in Boston, their resistance eventually will be the Boston Tea Party. That's not going to come right away, but eventually they're pushed to that. And I want to make the case that they are pushed to that. They are left with no other option. So Parliament's Tea Act does not impose a new tax. And a lot of people think that that's what it was. It wasn't. It actually removed a tax. So there was no new tax on the colonists. It actually removed a tax that was on the East India Company. So it used to be when they would import their tea from India, they paid an import tax. And of course, they had to pass that cost on to you. So now, whatever, tea costs $1 a pound. You pay 50 cents a pound in your tax. So now it's $1.50 coming into the colonies. Plus, there was a Townshend Act duty that they were trying to generate revenue just on the American colonists, so you might pay another 50 cents a pound in that tax. So all that to say, there was no new tax, but they dropped the tax on the East India Company. They retained the small Townshend Act tax that had been left on the books. Even though people were refusing tea, there wasn't much paying of it because there weren't hardly any imports of tea into the colonies. But that was exactly the problem. Is because the colonies were boycotting it and they were drinking hot chocolate and coffee. The East India Company, they didn't have a market to sell their tea to. So the tea starts piling up in the warehouses back in England, and they get so much of it, thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds of tea that are coming in, and there's nobody to sell it to. And they were afraid they were going to take this huge financial loss. So Parliament is coming to their rescue. And they're like, look, we can probably, we're not taking away the tax because by golly, those colonists are going to pay it, but we'll remove the tax that you're charged so that you're able to drop the cost dramatically. And it'll be so cheap that they'll surely buy it now because it'll way outstrip the Dutch tea. It'll be so much cheaper and our stuff's so much better. They'll buy it from you. They won't mind paying that tiny little tax. So that small Townshend duty to which the colonists objected remained in place. The idea being to help the East India Company. So the overarching idea was that it would be like getting your Starbucks drink. The colonists liked that English tea, but by golly, they were not paying that illegal tax. Well, now they've made it so stinking cheap that it would be like going to Starbucks and, okay, you can get your drink for $1. Just pay the tax. Or you can keep going to Dunkin' Donuts, which isn't your favorite anyway, and get your drink there, but it's $4. Now, it's tax-free, but it's $4 over there. What are you going to go for? I really love that Starbucks. But no, the colonists won't go for it. They refuse to pay that small Townshend duty. They would rather, on principle, continue to pay the higher price for any tea that they did get. They were not lured back in by this. They saw that it really was a test, a deceptive but deadly forcing of the American colonists to agree to a tax over which they had no consent. So it was an assault on their rights as Englishmen, and they knew if we cede that little piece of ground, they're going to grow it. It's going to just open the door for all kinds of other illegal taxation and illegal whatever else. The action and result was that the colonists stayed strong. They continued to send petitions, and they refused to allow the tea ships into their ports. So from Georgia, South Carolina, all up and down the coast, they were blocking tea ships from coming into the ports and unloading. This finally becomes a real issue, and 3 ships were escorted into Boston Harbor in November of 1773, really bringing this to a head. They were blocked in place by the British Navy so that the colonists couldn't force them back out and refuse delivery. So now you've got 3 ships sitting in Boston Harbor in November of 1773. Well, the law stated that they had to unload after either 20 or 40 days, I can't remember, but after a certain period of time, they had to unload their ships. If they didn't, the government would seize the cargo and they would force the tax to be paid by whoever the receiving merchants were. So the only way to avoid this illegal tax collection was to get those ships turned around, that they could not unload. We do not want that cargo unloaded. So negotiations begin. Leadership from Boston is negotiating with Governor Hutchinson, and things are really not going anywhere. I mean, up until the last day, you guys, they were sending emissaries and trying to negotiate with him to allow those ships to leave the harbor. And finally, last negotiation failed at the last possible moment. They exhausted all of their options. And the representatives of the Boston town meeting now vote to destroy that tea to prevent payment of the illegal tax. The thing you need to know, again, that we get this false idea that, again, these were some kind of rioting protesters that just came storming down to the ships and were just, violently hacking open tea chests and destroying everything in sight and throwing tea everywhere. And it was the opposite of that. It was like a surgical military exercise. They literally lined up in, I'm bad at military terminology. Anyway, like line by line. They lined up in military formations. They were divided into 3 groups, with commanders in charge, one for each ship, specific tasks. They were instructed to only destroy the tea, to be very careful to protect the property of the ship owners. Because guys, what was the whole issue? Was property. You should circle that. The whole issue was, we want our property, our tax money to be respected. We want to be able to give voluntary consent to the ways that revenues are raised. And so we're going to be very respectful of your property as well. The only thing that was destroyed were 342 chests of tea. The folks who came on board requested keys so that they can unlock the holds and not do damage, not hack through doors or anything like that. They were given the keys so that they could access the cargo holds. They relocked them when they were done. They swept the decks, neat, orderly, quiet. They said the only sounds you could hear were the hacking open of the tea chests and dumping into the harbor. Let me fill in some blanks for you. Sweeping the decks. There was a broken lock on one of the ships and it was replaced. No rioting, no mob action. This is a contemporary image of what was happening that evening. So here you see these folks on board dumping the tea. There were some of the group that disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians. The reason behind that is that the colonists at the time had adopted the Native American as a symbol of freedom. So for them, they were like dressing up as the Statue of Liberty or something as they came on board to dump this tea. And then you see these observers over here on the wharf. So there were hundreds of people that were standing there, observed the whole thing, and testified. It was quiet and orderly. And so that was December of 1773 when the Boston Tea Party took place. The response from Parliament, they were absolutely incensed at this, which was seen as rebellious behavior. How dare you question our authority in this way? So in the spring of 1774, there was a set of 4 laws passed by Parliament. They were called the Coercive Acts. To coerce someone is to force, if you want to put that up there in your margin. So the Coercive Acts were what they were called by Parliament. The colonists called them the Intolerable Acts. We will not tolerate that. They can't be tolerated. So the spring of 1774, these Intolerable Acts, a package of 4 laws, was passed in retaliation for the Boston Tea Party. The first one was the Boston Port Bill. Also, you should know there were actually several other ports that had smaller versions of tea parties. But Boston was seen as a center for leadership amongst the Patriot movement, and so they were targeted. They were going to be made an example of. So the Boston Port Bill would close Boston Harbor to all ships. A military blockade was placed around the city, and I'm going to show you a map of the city in a moment so you get a view of how this totally and absolutely cut them off from all commerce. So as of June 1st, 1774, they would be closed unless they agreed to pay for the destroyed tea and submit to all English laws. Well, they weren't going to do that. That was the point, is that they were still arguing against these violations of their English liberties. So it was designed to starve Bostonians into submission because their entire livelihoods depended largely on cod fishing, whaling, merchant ships, and then all the other businesses in town were dependent on those folks making money and doing what they did. So all of their goods had to come in by ship because this is Boston right here, right here. So it sits on this tiny little peninsula. This was all water, so they were surrounded by water, the Atlantic Ocean out this way. And you see this little tiny strip of land. In some places it was like 3 wagons wide, called the Boston Neck. And so the British military will set up a checkpoint right here on the Boston Neck, and military ships are blockading the harbor, and the town of Boston was entirely cut off and controlled now by the British military as of June 1st, 1774. The second part of the coercive acts was called the Massachusetts Government Bill, again targeting that colony. From now on, Governor Hutchinson would appoint his own council. They would no longer be elected by the people. He would also choose all the judges and all the sheriffs, replacing all judges and sheriffs who had been elected by the people. These royally appointed sheriffs were now supposed to choose the juries for trials. So that was problematic because people recognized, like, even if we are tried locally, the jury will all be loyalists. They will be people who are favoring the crown and its position, because the royally appointed sheriff is going to pick out the jury. Trials were also able to be moved outside the colony or to England if it was deemed necessary. The government bill moved the capital of Massachusetts from Boston, just arbitrarily picked a different city and said, no, you can no longer meet in Boston. You have to meet in Salem. But all the public records have to stay here in Boston. So it essentially kind of cut them off at the knees. They didn't have what they needed to actually conduct business. So it was in effect as if you had dissolved the assembly. So they moved it from Boston to Salem. They were limited to only 1 meeting per year, and all of the little local town meetings, Lexington and Concord and Salem and whatever, the local town councils were all told you can't meet at all unless you get permission from the royal governor. So it completely undermined any kind of local self-government. Again, guys, guaranteed in their charters, and they'd lived that under those charters. You've read the Massachusetts Bay Colonies Charter, the Massachusetts Bay Charter, and some of the Pilgrim Code of 1636, laying out how they're going to have their assemblies every year and who's going to be sent and how they vote and all those things that were laid out there. They've been living under those regulations for 150 years, and now it's being yanked out from under them. The third part was the Quartering Act. All this did, grab your highlighter, it just expanded the Quartering Act. So it was already bad, but now you couldn't even be fully reimbursed for what you were asked to provide for these soldiers. So only fractional reimbursement. And if troops there in Massachusetts were accused of a crime against a citizen, so let's say that you had these soldiers staying in your unoccupied barn back in the back 40 on your property there, but you've got some soldiers staying out there, and then you suddenly notice that there's a bunch of stuff missing from the barn, so you bring them to court because you believe that they have stolen and sold some of your harness and whatever. Well, that trial will not take place in the colonies, so they will be only tried in English military courts back at home. Well, are you going to be able to pay to go across the ocean and testify against these guys? No. And is it likely that they are going to have a more friendly audience and a friendly judge than they would here locally? So it just brought up all kinds of fears that it could be crimes even worse, like attacking your daughter, and they would not be tried for that here in the colonies, that it would allow them to get off scot-free for crimes against the colonists. So the colonists called it, the Bostonians called this the Murder Act, not just the Quartering Act, because they believed that it would encourage lawlessness and abuse in the British troops occupying Boston, knowing that they would not be held accountable locally for their crimes. And then finally, I have to mention the Quebec Act because it's going to come up again in the Declaration of Independence. So one of the coercive acts was called the Quebec Act, and it expanded the boundaries of Canadian territory southward. And it also allowed for some French law to be honored, not just English common law anymore, but French laws were now going to be used, including no trials. The trials did not have to have a jury. You were not guaranteed that right. Now, does that necessarily affect you in Massachusetts? Well, it did, because they were already taking it away from you. But they felt that it was a direct threat to them, allowing this other form of government to pressed down close to the boundaries of Massachusetts, as well as toleration for Roman Catholicism. Guys, remember why their forefathers came. The Puritans came because they wanted religious liberty and because they had experienced such persecution even under the Church of England, which had been trying to move back towards Catholicism at that time. So they saw this as a threat to their religious liberty and their civil liberty by England giving more authority, more land, more influence to Catholics in Quebec and offering French law, allowing French law to grow in that territory. The response to the coercive acts, what England and Parliament had hoped is that all the other colonies would be quaking in their boots and realize we better cooperate or it could happen to us. What happened was they went, that could happen to us. And they united in support behind Boston. They realized if they can do it to them, they can do it to us. We better support them. So persecution served to unite the colonies. In Virginia, their House of Burgesses will pass a resolution. It's written by Jefferson and Patrick Henry. Y'all know I love my Patrick Henry. So they'll pass a resolution calling for a national day of prayer, fasting, and humiliation on the very day that Boston Harbor will be blockaded, June 1st, 1774. On that day, prominent men from across Virginia, much like that Stamp Act, or excuse me, if you haven't seen it yet. Yes, I think you did see the Give Me Liberty. Yes, the Give Me Liberty video you've already watched. So much like that amalgamation of people, we have very prominent men from across Virginia, from George Washington to Peyton Randolph, Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, came marching down the Duke of Gloucester Street from the Capitol in procession, heard a sermon there in Bruton Parish Church, which still stands today. You can stand in the very place where it happened, and then prayed and fasted the rest of the day. And that's exactly what Washington recorded that he did in his journal on June 1st, 1774. We see colonial assemblies voting support financially. They're sending supplies and food and money and getting it into Boston to help those people survive. The colonies then also, I would highlight and circle this last point, this will push them over the edge to unite. And that's why I put this image here, this join or die image. It was an older image developed by Benjamin Franklin back during the French and Indian War, but it now becomes popular again, recognizing that we as colonies have got to support one another. And so they will vote to all 13 colonies will send representatives to Philadelphia to meet and discuss what are our next steps to try to maintain peace but preserve liberties. And they call that meeting a Continental Congress. So it'll be the first Continental Congress. It's the first time you have people, leaders from South Carolina like the Rutledges, meeting Virginians like Patrick Henry and the Adamses from Massachusetts. If you're wondering too, why the stake? Like, let's kind of, what's up with that image? Why not something else nicer that's joining together? The imagery is intentional. The rattlesnake was considered to be a snake, an honorable reptile, because he warns before he strikes. So this is also where you get the slogan, "Don't tread on me." Don't press me down. Don't walk on me, because you'll get bitten. I will defend myself. So a rattlesnake is not an offensive animal, but it warns you that it's going to defend itself if you keep poking at the snake. So that's why they chose that imagery of the rattlesnake, because it was considered, again, to be an honorable animal that warned its enemy before striking. The long-term suffering, because now we've had this going on since 1761, and we are at 1774. So 13 years now, we've been enduring and petitioning and trying to make progress, asking for repeal of these illegal acts. But all of this really caused the colonists to see their great weakness, how very militarily strong Britain was, that they had to be dependent on God, that they needed to be right with him, that they couldn't afford, they had to have his blessing if they were going to win this. that some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we have to trust in the name of the Lord our God. They thought back to what had happened in 1746 with the French fleet, that God had fought the battle for them and defeated the mighty French fleet. And gosh, we need God on our side. Therefore, we must be right with God. We have to be fighting for things that are godly and biblical. And so it drove them again deep into the writings of Calvin and Beza and the Huguenots and Sir Edward Coke and Rutherford, right? Samuel Rutherford, who had been one of the men who wrote the Westminster Catechism. So what did he say again in Lex Rex? And Locke and Sidney, Montesquieu and Blackstone. So they're reading deeply and drawing deeply on these biblical principles, recognizing they need to have this right if they expect God's blessing. It also provided time. So 13 years will become 15 by the time we get to independence. Well, this gave lots of time to actually educate the colonists on principles rather than just, I'm mad about this issue. I'm mad about this quartering of troops that's happening in, Delaware. They really had to think deeply about how this impacted all of them, whether or not it was happening in their own colony. What were the deeper ideas that were at stake? So principles rather than issues they were educated on, and it strengthened their thinking about their liberties and where those liberties came from and why they needed to protect private property at all costs, and that it wasn't just that I'm mad about paying a tax, but private property, I have to have it if I'm going to govern my family well and if I'm going to contribute to my church as I'm commanded to by God. And those became the things that they were really thinking about. It built courage in these colonists because they concluded these were God-given rights and that they were bound to answer to God. I would even write that in the margin, that they began to really fear God so much more than they feared man. And they were recognizing, look, these are God-given liberties, and we are probably going to suffer a lot if we continue to stand for these. But we would rather that than to be in chains and living under tyranny. And so they came together on September 5th, 1774. Remember, the blockade started in June. September 5th, they gather in Philadelphia for the first time. The purpose was to make peace with England. Guys, I want you to get that really clear. Sometimes people think that the First Continental Congress was to declare independence and start fighting a war. By no means. They are still very much of the mind. They're going to be of the mindset all the way to the bitter end of making peace with a tyrant king, doing everything in their power to walk through Rutherford's biblical resistance, petitioning, fleeing if possible, and finally just defensive resistance. This was the first time when they gathered in Philadelphia in September that representatives from all 13 of the British colonies had met together because they thought of themselves as very independent, that they were distinct bodies. They had independent charters and agreements with the king directly. So what Virginia has with the king is very different than what South Carolina or Massachusetts has, and we simply deal with him. And we don't really need to deal with each other. Well, again, letters from a Pennsylvania farmer, committees of correspondence, all of that had begun to change those things over the years, change that idea that they really did need to work together. So the fact that they are actively now working together really cannot be overstated. It had to have gotten really bad for these representatives to come together in Philadelphia. Also, they recognized that by doing this, that the king would see it as treasonous activity and that they might really pay a high price for participating. This group will produce two documents, the Declaration and Resolves, and something called a petition for redress. You should recognize those words, right? A petition for redress of grievances. That's what the Petition of Right of 1628 was. They're going to produce the same kinds of documents. So I want to look at those briefly. Grab your highlighter. So it's going to take them several weeks, but by October 14th now of 1774, they've drafted their Declaration and Resolves. And you're going to hear echoed here many of the same issues we've been now discussing. So these events that I've talked about and these acts that were passed by Parliament, like the Intolerable Acts, we're now going to see them address those things in this document, which is their petition back to Parliament. So they say, the British Parliament, I'm just going to do the bold part, and guys, the bold part is what you would highlight. The British Parliament claiming a power of right to bind the people of America in all cases whatsoever, has expressly imposed taxes on them under various pretenses, but in fact for the purpose of raising a revenue. So they may have been pretending that it was a duty to regulate trade. That was a pretense, they're saying. What they're doing is highlight, bold, whatever. They're imposing taxes for the purpose of raising revenue. The problem here, taxation for revenue, is a power that has been reserved to our colonial assemblies in our charters and by tradition of English common law. This is really the same argument that you saw Patrick Henry making in his Stamp Act resolves last week or the week before. They have established a board of commissioners. Remember, they are going to establish this board, and they are all hanging out in Boston with unconstitutional powers, and you've extended the jurisdiction of the courts of admiralty, not only for collecting the duties, but for the trial of causes merely arising within the body of a county. So these people are actually now conducting trials not just related to the collection of duties, but other causes as well that have arisen. So the problem is that these are officials that are not locally elected. We are guaranteed in our charters the right of local self-government. These are king-appointed officials who are now acting in a capacity that's outside our charter. They are, again, subjecting us to illegal trials, and these trials are often not just related to the illegal tax, but to just everyday issues, violating our rights as Englishmen. Judges, they're going to complain, who before held only estates at will in their offices. In other words, estates at will means we have control. Our will determines their position. So judges who before held only estates at will in their offices have now been made dependent on the crown for their salaries. The king is paying them directly, where we used to appoint and pay for our own judges. So the problem is, we used to do it ourselves. They now answer to the king alone. That produces doubtful justice, doesn't it? And the king is responsible to actually provide justice for his people. They complain standing armies are being kept in times of peace. Well, that is explicitly, guys, against the Bill of Rights, Article number 5, says that you're never to do that because it's meant to intimidate and control the people. It's expressly forbidden by English law, and yet you're doing it to us. They say next, it has lately been resolved in Parliament that by a force of a statute made in the 35th year of the reign of King Henry VIII. Guys, how long ago did King Henry VIII reign? It was in the early 1500s, the first half of the 1500s. This was 200 years ago. And they're like, Parliament just pulled up this statute from 200 years ago in order to say that colonists may now be transported to England and tried there on accusations for treason. They're like, that's not even right, because special courts, any kind of a special court like Henry VIII was asking for, which was meant for like time of war in Europe, those have all been since recognized as illegal. They are a violation of our right to a trial by jury of our peers, meaning local people. So them dredging up some old statute from 200 years ago and trying to apply it to us, again, is outside the English common law and outside the rights granted by our charters. Whereas in the last session of Parliament, the coercive acts were passed, and then they named them one by one. They said they're all unjust and cruel, and they're unconstitutional, and they're most dangerous and destructive of American rights. And whereas assemblies have been frequently dissolved. Remember that? Anytime we try to petition, we get dissolved. Well, that's contrary to the rights of the people. When they attempt to just deliberate on grievances, we're just trying to talk about some of the problems that we're experiencing. And we have dutiful, humble, loyal, and reasonable petitions to the Crown. We've been drafting these petitions to the Crown for redress. What's redress? Redress of grievances would be making it right, correcting. So we've been submitting these humble, dutiful, loyal, reasonable petitions, and they've been repeatedly treated with contempt by His Majesty's ministers of state. What's the problem? Well, It's a violation of Magna Carta 61, which tells us that's what we're supposed to do, but the king's not responding. No one's, correcting anything. It's been the standard since the 1640s that Parliament controls its own meeting times. You can't just dissolve our assemblies because we have a grievance against the abuses of the king. Bill of Rights, Article 5 and 9 allow for petitions to the king and allow for free discussion of grievances within our assemblies. The good people of the several colonies, and they then name all of the colonies that are represented there, justly alarmed at these arbitrary proceedings of Parliament and administration, have elected deputies to meet and sit in General Congress in the city of Philadelphia in order to obtain such establishment as that their religion, their laws, and their liberties may not be subverted, trampled on, treaded on, right? What's key here, I want you to get, is that the good people of the several colonies have elected deputies. This is proper biblical resistance. It's not a mob. It's the people saying we are going to work through lower magistrates, just like Samuel Rutherford spelled out in his process of biblical resistance. We will work through representatives that we select that will go meet in Philadelphia and determine the best process for trying to maintain both peace and our liberties. The lower magistrates will represent the people against the tyranny of the king. Whereupon the deputies do, as Englishmen, we are Englishmen, as their ancestors in like cases have usually done, for the purpose of asserting and vindicating their rights and liberties. What are we doing? These deputies, we are Englishmen. And we're calling back on the example of our ancestors who've gone before us, who have petitioned a tyrant king. So we do that too, and we now declare, that's why it's called a declaration, we declare that the inhabitants of the English colonies in North America, by the immutable laws of nature. Guys, what are the laws of nature? Blackstone said they are the laws of nature and nature's God. The laws of nature are God's laws. So we claim by God's law, by the principles of the English Constitution, and by our charters and compacts that we have the following rights. This should again ring a bell, just like Petition of Right. They are rooting it every time in law. According to this case, we have this law, right? According to this statute, according to that from way back when. They're doing exactly the same thing. Just as our ancestors have done in the past, we are asserting and vindicating our rights and liberties because of the law of nature, God's law, the principles of the English Constitution, and our charters or compacts. We appeal to the law for these rights. But the most important law being this one, the laws of nature, which supersede even the English Constitution because they're God's laws. Resolved. This should all sound familiar too. Get your highlighter ready. Resolved. Because of all that, here's what we declare. We are entitled to life, liberty, and property. There's that phrase, life, liberty, and property. We've never ceded to any sovereign power whatever a right to dispose of either of those without our consent. We have to give our consent before you can mess with our life, liberty, and property. Our ancestors who first settled these colonies were entitled to all the rights, liberties, and immunities of Englishmen. It's in our charters. When we immigrated, we didn't forfeit any of that. That's what 3 says. 4, the foundation of English liberty and all free government is the right of the people to participate. How do you participate? Representation. Okay, they aren't represented in the British Parliament. They are entitled to exclusive power of legislation in their provincial. I know that's fancy language. We have the right to legislate for ourselves, and the only place we can do that is in our local legislatures, because that's where our representation is preserved. This is the only place we can be represented. Number 5, we're entitled to the common law of England, especially being tried by our peers. And we're entitled to the English statutes that existed at the time of our colonization. So all the English law should apply to us as well. Resolved that our colonies are entitled to all the immunities and privileges. Guys, immunities and privileges are rights. We're entitled to all the rights that are granted and confirmed by our charters or have been secured by our codes of law. We're entitled to be ruled under those things because the king has approved them over the years. We've always had this. Number 8, they have a right to assemble peaceably and to consider grievances and to petition the king. It's been guaranteed to us in the Bill of Rights. So if you prosecute us or you send out these prohibitory proclamations, if you arrest us for that, it's illegal. Okay, that's what they're saying here. We have a right peaceably to assemble. Remember that language. You're going to hear it again. Number 9, keeping a standing army in these colonies without consent of the legislature of the colony, that's against the law. They're right, it is. It's against the law. 10, it is necessary to good government and rendered essential by the English Constitution that the exercise of legislative power in the colonies by a council appointed by the crown, that's unconstitutional and dangerous and destructive to the freedom of American legislation. Parliament governing over us is illegal and dangerous and unconstitutional. All of which, all those things, the deputies, okay, representing the people, that's when they say deputies, the representatives, on behalf of themselves and their constituents, watch this language, they do claim, demand, and insist on. I would highlight that. Well, I highlighted the whole thing, but they do claim, demand, and insist on. Make a point there, guys. That is the same language we saw in the English Bill of Rights. When they finally invite William and Mary, they get rid of that horrible tyrant, James II, who had been abusing their rights again, and they're like, oh gosh, are we going to have to have another war? And they say, look, guy, it's time to step down, or we've called William and his army and your daughter, Mary, and we've invited them to take the throne. James the tyrant disappears, William and Mary come to the throne, and Parliament presents them with the English Bill of Rights, and they, in that document, say, look, we claim, demand, and insist on our rights and liberties as Englishmen, because they're not going there again. It's the same language you see here in this declaration coming from the representatives of the 13 colonies. So they say, look, those things can't be legally taken from them. They can't be altered or abridged by any power whatever without our consent by our representatives in our provincial legislatures. And I said, what is the mood of this statement? Is this like begging for peace? And they want peace, but they're being very firm. You might have another word for it, but they are claiming, demanding, and insisting. And so now comes the resolved part. Resolved that the following acts of Parliament are infringements and violations, and they then list all these violations. And then finally they say, look, all of that is not appropriate and it must be resolved. And so for right now, here's what we're going to do. We're going to enter into a non-importation, a boycott. We're not importing, we're not exporting, we're not consuming British goods. We're done. So we're cutting you off. I know you got your little blockade up in Boston, but the rest of us, we're not buying from you anymore, and we're not sending you anything. So we're boycotting you. We're going to hit you in the pocketbook. We're also going to prepare an address. So we're going to write something that'll be published for the people of Great Britain so that they'll understand where we're coming from. And finally, we're going to write something directly to the king. So a petition. And they do. All right, guys, that's the Declaration and Resolves. Pretty firm document laying out their grievances, their rights, and their statement about their claiming of their rights. And finally, this last, here's the consequences clause. So the underlying principles are, we've got a united declaration. All 13 colonies are now united in sending one document with their grievances and an assertion of their rights. They're still acting as independent colonies, but they're sending this together. They say the rights come from 3 places, remember? The higher law of God, the principles of English law, and their individual compacts or charters, the individual agreements they have with the king. So what we have here is a petition. We want you to come back under, we want you to repeal these things that are wrong, but we're already moving to a little bit of distress and harass. We've been petitioning forever. So now we're moving into, we're going to boycott you. and try to hurt you economically. And then they also, of course, say we're going to also prepare these other statements. So it's a petition with already a little bit of distress and harass out of Magna Carta 61. 9 days later, they finished their petition to the king. So they're going to just do these two documents. They all came together. Let's do these two things. So second thing was a petition for redress of grievances to King George III. I just gave you a tiny bit, but let's read it. Filled with sentiments of duty to your majesty and of affection to our parent state, we present this petition only to obtain redress of grievances, appealing to that being, God, who thoroughly searches the hearts of his creatures. We solemnly profess that our counsels have been influenced by no other motive than a dread of impending destruction. We fear what's about to happen over here. So we beseech your majesty, beseech is beg, that your royal authority and your interposition please intervene so that that can be used for our relief and that a gracious answer may be given to this petition. Guys, different mood, right? So the communication with the king directly, it has a very humble, peace-seeking, that's what conciliatory means, very peace-seeking kind of a mood, as opposed to, now they mean both things. They're not being double-minded, but they are asking the king, they're look, Parliament, you've way overstepped, and they know the king is going to see that as well. King, please intervene. We don't want to have to break away. Do the right thing. Underlying principles. This, too, is part of a proper Magna Carta Article 61 intervention. What happens? Well, they finish the documents, and everybody goes home. Remember, this is October of 1774. They wait for what they hope is going to be a favorable response. Thanksgiving comes, November comes, Christmas comes. No response was ever sent. Literally, they're ignored. From October to March of 1775, hundreds of more British troops are arriving. So again, the message is not I'm listening to you and I'm willing to negotiate. It's a doubling down of forcing you to cooperate with parliamentary authority. So major cities are occupied, Minutemen begin to drill, statesmen are warning their people, pastors are preaching the principles of liberty and inspiring their people, tensions are rising. And that's the backdrop for the Give Me Liberty speech that you studied for homework last week. And so right here is where I want you to insert that study of Patrick Henry's speech that you did. So just after this page is where those homework sheets would go. And what we see in Henry's speech is he is communicating that your liberties, they're in grave danger, right? We looked at exactly what he said. He's reminding the House of Burgesses, look, we have done the biblical resistance process. We have petitioned. We have remonstrated. We have prostrated ourselves at the foot of the throne. Like, we've done all those right things. But there's been no response. Guys, we've been spurned from the foot of the throne. What's the next step? We can't flee. There's nowhere for us to go. So he's saying, look, we better get ourselves ready to defend. We're not getting ready to go to war, but we have to defend our liberties. So he's convincing the Virginia Assembly, as you saw in your homework, to prepare defensive resistance by forming a militia that will answer to the Assembly itself, not to the governor, but it answers to the Assembly. And number 5, he seems prophetic because he says, the next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. He's saying, there's a war is about to break out. We better be ready to defend ourselves. Our brethren are already in the field. Well, they weren't already in the field, but they would be just a few weeks later. And guys, that becomes kind of the hallmark of Patrick Henry. It always has been. He has a vision. He knows what the consequences are going to be if we don't act now. He sees the handwriting on the wall over and over and over again. So he saw it back at the time of the Stamp Act. He sees it now, and he's going to see it later as well. So sure enough, April 19th, 1775, that's when the first shots are fired. This is important. The first shots are fired on Lexington Green, not because the militia goes out to fight the British. It's because the British march out from Boston into these little towns because they want to capture all of their powder and their weapons. They want to take them away from them. They want to disarm the people. And so they stand in defense, and they fire on them defensively. The British, we aren't sure who fires the first shot. There's still great debate about that. But whatever the firing, we know who initiated this conflict. It was the British who marched out of Boston to come and take away any means of defense that the colonists had. That particular event, what's going to happen on the way back, there's a 20-mile march back to Boston, and militia groups show up from all over the place, and they really bloody the British. There's tremendous losses to the British Army as they're trying to get their troops back into Boston. They had no idea what they were up against. So now we've got an issue. Now we have actual bloodshed. Now we have men lining up against one another and shooting at each other. So we got an actual kind of shooting war that's begun as of April 1775. So we have to have a response, meaning all those guys, they need to come back and meet together again. So May of 1775, just a few months after they sent their petitions, now they're back together, and they're called the Second Continental Congress at this point. One of the first things that this group will do is that they authorize a continental army. So we're all going to send troops into one place and get organized under one leader, and that's going to be George Washington. He's the commander of the newly formed Continental Army. They also will try again for peace with Britain by providing an explanation. All 13 colonies will come together and draft an explanation for why we've had to take up arms. Why is it that there has been bloodshed? They feel like they need to really explain this to the whole world, to the watching world. And while they're in their meetings, they get word on June 17th, so about a month after they've started their meetings, they get word that these militia groups up in Boston who had been attacked earlier, they had come closer to town. They had set up this fort kind of overlooking the town of Boston to prevent another attack on the surrounding towns. So they had this fortified hill, and the British had come and marched against that hill. That hill was Bunker Hill, or it was the Battle of Bunker Hill. And so again, there's bloodshed, and the British kind of get the worst of it once again at that battle. But this is going to intensify things there at the Second Continental Congress, the fact that there's now been additional bloodshed. So first document, they're going to draft two again. The first one, July 5th, 1775, they finish it. It's the Olive Branch Petition. An olive branch is symbolic of peace. And there's some debate about drafting the Olive Branch Petition. There are people that think we've petitioned enough, and there are others that say we have to try again. So just a little excerpt, Your Majesty's ministers. This is actually important because they initially want to be sure that they are explaining that this is defensive. We are not initiating this bloodshed. It's Your Majesty's ministers who have persevered in their measures, and they've proceeded to open hostilities for enforcing those illegal acts. And they've compelled us, they've forced us to arm in our own defense. Guys, I really do want you to get that you're going to see the founders over and over again explain the fact that they are only acting defensively. Why are they doing that? Not only are they explaining it that way, but that's all that they're doing. They refuse to act on the offense because they want to be in line with Scripture. They want to be perfectly executing biblical resistance and none else. They say, we think ourselves required by indispensable obligations to Almighty God and to Your Majesty and to our fellow subjects and to ourselves, immediately to use all the means in our power that's not incompatible with our safety for stopping the further bloodshed, effusion of blood, and for averting impending calamities. So we then beseech, we see that language again, we're begging Your Majesty that Your royal authority may be graciously interposed to relieve us from these illegal laws and actions and settle peace. Please, Majesty, give us some mode, some way by which our petitions may be improved into happy and permanent reconciliation. We want peace. They do ask at the end that such statutes as immediately distress any of Your Majesty's colonies be repealed. So that's one way that would help us to stop all this stuff, is if we would immediately repeal these illegal laws and actions. Please give us relief. We're petitioning you to do the right thing. They also draft the declaration. It's a very long name, y'all, but a declaration by the representatives of the United Colonies of North America, now met in Congress at Philadelphia. But here's the gist. setting forth the causes and necessity of their taking up arms. Here's why we've had to take up arms. And here's what they say. A reverence for our Creator, principles of humanity, and the dictates of common sense have to convince all who reflect on the subject that government was instituted to promote the welfare of mankind. Guys, government was instituted for the good of man. Man was not created for the state. Government is to serve man. It ought to be administered for the attainment of that end. But the legislature of Great Britain has violated that, is what the rest of this really says. So the point is, God has created civil government for the good of mankind, but Parliament seeks our total destruction, and they've now forced us to take up arms. Now, it's written by our Pennsylvania farmer, John Dickinson, along with Thomas Jefferson. Then they get into all of the grievances, all of the oppressive acts, like they did before in the First Continental Congress. They also talk about what's just happened at Lexington and Concord, that these were unprovoked attacks. You guys came out and attacked us, and we defended ourselves. We are reduced then to the alternative of choosing an unconditional submission to the tyranny of irritated ministers or resistance by force. So you might put a 1 and a 2. We can choose unconditional submission, slavery in chains, as Patrick Henry said, or we can resist. We must fight, okay? The latter is our choice. This is firm. These are firm words, y'all. We've counted the cost of this contest. We find nothing so dreadful as voluntary slavery. Honor and justice and humanity forbid us tamely to surrender that freedom which we received from our gallant ancestors and which our innocent posterity have a right to receive from us. It has been passed down to us. We have a responsibility to guard, protect these ancient liberties, rights of Englishmen, and pass them on untarnished to our posterity. Guys, you have that same responsibility today. You have been gifted incredible liberty, incredible rights in this country. We have a right to we have a responsibility, a duty to understand them, to protect them, and to pass them on to your children. You won't be here forever. What are you leaving to the next generation? We cannot endure the infamy and guilt of resigning succeeding generations to the wretchedness which inevitably awaits them if we basely entail hereditary bondage upon them. If we don't do the right thing, we can't stand the thought of the reputation we would have. So, summarizing that paragraph, we're being forced to choose between tyranny or resistance, and we choose resistance. We have a duty to protect the freedom received from our ancestors and pass it to the next generation. They say our cause is just, our union is perfect, our internal resources. We've got cotton and iron and, we have resources. And if necessary, we can get foreign assistance. We gratefully acknowledge as signal instances of the divine favor towards us that God's providence would not permit us to be called into this severe controversy until we were grown up to our present strength. That's actually a really beautiful thing. They're saying, God did not allow us to face this controversy with you until we were ready. We didn't know, but God was allowing us to grow up in our strength and in our ability to provide for ourselves. And we even got to practice doing war. We previously exercised, we got to do the French and Indian War to get ourselves ready to fight. And we now possess the means of defending ourselves. So our hearts are strengthened, fortified. We most solemnly, before God and the world, declare, here's the declaration, they declare that the arms that we've been compelled to assume, you forced us to take up arms, we will employ them for the preservation of our liberties, being resolved to die free men rather than to live slaves. That's wonderful language as well. We summarize that here. We've been forced to defend ourselves. We will use those arms to preserve liberty, and we will live free or die. That becomes, I believe, the slogan, the motto for the colony of New Hampshire. Live free or die. They go on, lest this declaration would disquiet the minds of our fellow subjects in any part of the empire, we want to assure you that we aren't trying to dissolve the Union. We want to remain, we're going to defend our liberties, we're going to fight, but we don't want to have to. Okay, necessity has not yet driven us into that desperate measure of declaring independence. We've not raised armies with ambitious designs of separating from Great Britain. We don't want to be independent states. That is not our design. We don't want independence. But here, we're in our native land, they're telling Parliament, in defense of the freedom that is our birthright, that's number one, and for the protection of our property that's been acquired by the honest industry, the work of our forefathers, the labor of our forefathers and of ourselves. We've acquired this property. We're going to protect our property. We're going to defend our freedom. Life, liberty, property, you guys. We've taken up arms for that because there was violence actually offered, and so we've taken up arms. We'll lay down our arms when hostilities cease on the part of the aggressors, and all danger of their being renewed is removed. We will not lay our arms down before that. So very firm language, peace seeking. We don't want independence, but we will resist tyranny. We fight in defense of our freedom and our property. And then they end with a humble confidence in the mercies of the supreme and impartial judge and ruler of the universe. We most devoutly implore his divine goodness to protect us happily through this great conflict, to dispose our adversaries, that would be you, to reconciliation on reasonable terms, and thereby to relieve the empire from the calamities of civil war. We don't want to go there. Well, without even seeing the Olive Branch petition, the king responds, because he's heard about not only Lexington and Concord, but he's heard about Bunker Hill. And so his immediate emotional response, he lashes out in August 1775 with a proclamation for suppressing rebellion and sedition. In it, what he calls on is not just the officers, both military and civilian, but anybody employed by the king is already supposed to be suppressing anything that they think is patriotic behavior. But now he commands that all of his subjects, everybody, you're supposed to turn in your neighbor if you suspect that they have patriotic sympathies. So all of our subjects of this realm are bound by law to aid and assist in the suppression of what he calls a rebellion. So you're supposed to turn in your neighbors if you're suspecting them of being patriot sympathizers, if they're helping the committees of correspondence, if they're supplying a place to meet or food or anything, they are now considered to be treasonous. He follows that almost immediately in December 1775, passed by the Parliament, signed by the king, the Prohibitory Act. Guys, this is a big deal. The Prohibitory Act, passed by the British Parliament, will make all trade. Now remember, they decided they weren't trading with the British anyway, but now they're not allowed to trade with anybody else. That had been our source of income. There have been other countries, the French, the Dutch, that are willing to trade with us. No, we're going to blockade all your ports. We're cutting all of you off. Just like we cut Boston off, everybody's cut off. The mighty British Navy is on the way. And we rule the seas, and they did. They were the most powerful navy on the globe, cutting you off. They also declared that any of the king's subjects who tried to trade or support those who did were now called open enemies. So if you desperately, number one, you think this is illegal, so you do continue to try to trade with the Dutch to support your family and keep things going, you're a traitor, you're an open enemy, to be so adjudged, deemed, and taken in all courts. It also declared any American ship that was caught trading would be seized, your cargo would be sold for benefit of the crown, and all your sailors would be forced to join the British Navy and fight against their own people. No reimbursement to the owner. Finally, it removed the protections of the English common law and of the British military in defending traditional rights of Englishmen. It declared them to be out of his protection. You are no longer seen as English citizens. You are seen as enemies of the crown, and you will be treated as such. You no longer are afforded. You don't have any of the rights of Englishmen because we don't view you anymore as Englishmen. It was designed, the military was to be used to seize property and force compliance with what the colonists were still maintaining were unconstitutional, illegal acts. But guys, this was huge, declaring them really out of his protection. He's authorizing war on his own people. They have repeatedly stated that they are loyal to the king. They simply are petitioning him for redress of grievances, to come back under the law. But because he refuses to acknowledge the law, and Parliament refuses to acknowledge their responsibility to govern under the law, we've really reached this place of irreconcilable. There's no way to reconcile. But by declaring them out of his protection, with no regard to their repeated statements of loyalty or their petitions, he's declaring independence from them. Again, I really want you to get this, okay? So pause if you need to and clear your brain and come back. When the king issues the prohibitory act and declares his own people out of his protection, guys, what is civil government supposed to do? Justice and protection. And now they're not doing that. At Christmas of 1775, the Second Continental Congress, they'd sent off their olive branch petition. Again, this is when we get into the issue of wait times. This was passed at December of 1775, but they're not going to know about it for 6 weeks. So they're still all celebrating Christmas at home happily and hopefully waiting for a response to the olive branch petition, where they begged him to repeal these horrible acts. They don't get any response to the olive branch petition. But in early February, probably late January, early February, they find out about this and realize that's the end. There's no more negotiating. There's not been any more bloodshed, nothing else, but the king's heart is hardened towards them. That brings me to this statement. Guys, who is in control? Who raises up kings? Who moves their hearts? God does. It's in his providence. We look back at it and go, why in the world would the king not negotiate? Why would he want to risk war with his own people and stretch all his resources, and when they were already suffering so much? Guys, the king's heart's in the hand of the Lord. As the rivers of water, he turns it however he will. Exodus 10:20 says, you can imagine the children of Israel wanted nothing more than for Pharaoh's heart to be softened towards them and for them to be able to worship God, and then they were happy to continue loyally serving Pharaoh. But what did God have for them? He had liberty waiting for them, but they needed to be essentially forced out of their situation of bondage. And so we see a lot of similarities here, because the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart so that he would not let the children of Israel go. And eventually they'll be forced to just leave. Patrick Henry wrote this: I have no doubt that God, who in former years had hardened Pharaoh's heart that he might show forth his power and glory in the redemption of his chosen people, has for similar purposes permitted the flagrant outrages which have occurred. Therefore, we have only to trust in the never-changing, all-powerful God of hosts. Isn't that the truth? I'm going to leave you with this. These are some reminders to you about what you've learned about the responsibility of the king towards his people. Remember Deuteronomy 17:18 through 20. Talked about the first duty of the king of Israel was to write out a book of the law and keep it with him so he wouldn't turn to the right or to the left. Why, guys? So that he wouldn't be lifted up above his brothers, so he wouldn't think he was above the law. Romans 13 talks about the duty of the king is that he's not a terror to good conduct. He's a terror to bad conduct. Well, this king had now become a terror to good conduct. He's doing exactly the opposite. He's carrying out God's wrath, not on the wrongdoer. He's carrying out God's wrath on people that are trying to hold him to the law, which he's under. The Vindiciae contra Tyrannos, the writings of the Huguenots, said, remember, there's ever and in all places a mutual and reciprocal obligation between the people and the prince. If the prince fails in his promise, the people are exempt from obedience. They don't have to obey if he breaks his contract. The contract is then made void, and the rights of obligation to that prince are of no force. Samuel Rutherford, he's our Westminster Catechism pastor and author of Lex Rex. The king can do all things which by a law he can do. The king cannot be above the covenant and law made betwixt him and his people at his coronation oath. Algernon Sidney, after the English Civil War, the only ends, the goal, the purpose for which governments are constituted and your obedience is rendered to them are obtaining justice and protection. If they can't provide for both, they give the people a right to take such ways as best please themselves in order to provide for their own safety. People can throw off that government if it's refusing to provide justice and protection. Guys, what did the king just do? He declared them out of his protection. He declared independence from them. Blackstone wrote, "When protection ends, so does the duty of the allegiance of the people protected." John Adams put it this way: it throws 13 colonies out of the royal protection. It levels all distinctions. It makes us independent. In spite of our supplications, we didn't want to be independent. We told him we didn't want to be independent. He made us independent. He says it may be fortunate, I would highlight this, it may be fortunate that the act of independency should come from the British Parliament rather than the American Congress. Who declared independence? Well, by their actions, the king and Parliament declared independence from their own colonies. Finally, the Continental Congress wrote this: "As to the king, we had been bound to him by allegiance, but this bond was now dissolved, because he assented to the late act of Parliament by which he declares us out of his protection." He has declared independence from us. And so, in June of 1776, the Lee Resolution was introduced to the Second Continental Congress. Guys, I cannot stress to you enough how solemn, how heavy this was. This moment when, at long last, the idea of independence was presented to the people. Richard Henry Lee, who you saw supporting Patrick Henry back at the time of the Liberty or Death speech, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia was the one instructed to introduce this. Virginia sent him and said, "We want you to try to go ahead and move towards independence." And he introduced this motion: resolved that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved. That was June 7th, 1776. At that point, the delegates from the 13 colonies would return to their colonies to receive instructions about whether or not to vote for independence. It would be a month later that they would cast those deciding votes. That's where we're going to pick up with your homework. Your initial homework is to look at the opening words of the introduction to the Declaration of Independence, those very famous words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, right? So we're going to look at that. You're going to memorize that introduction. And then I'm also going to have you do a little bit of homework on the Articles of Confederation. It comes right out of, I don't have the book here, but your Story of the Constitution, the book that you ordered to go with this class. So you've got chapter 3, some work to do in the Story of the Constitution. All right, y'all have a great week. Be in touch if you have any questions as always. And I look forward to seeing you next week.